There we go. We are live. I kind of like this camera angle. It's pretty good. Oh, yeah. 6 viewers already. Let's go. Were y'all in the waiting room? Did people get a notification before I actually came on? That would be cool. Whoops. That was pretty bad. I'm worse with the pick. I've gotten so used to finger picking and put so much practice into finger picking. Not as much practice as I should, but I'll try and do a finger picking song, I guess. Hi, Ware Pilgrim. Hello, Cobra Commander. Welcome to the show. I didn't make any banners yet. Whoops. I will do that in a sec. Actually, I'll do that right now. Welcome. Just waiting for some people to filter in. Waiting for people to filter while we wait for the show to start. Before we start talking about what I got planned for today, which is a great show, I tell you what. I put a lot of time into planning today's show for y'all. Hold on, you can see my plan in a second here. You'll be able to see it flash up on the screen. There it is. There's our stream plan for today. A fraction of it. There's 17 pages technically. Whoops, I didn't mean to stop sharing my screen. All right, I'm pumped. I am pumped. Fuck. Dang, I shouldn't swear. I swear a lot when I play guitar because I mess up. Eric the Bread, what's up, comrade? Welcome back again. Pretty good, huh? I got that down, like, I'd say 80 to 85% of where I want it to be today. So I can then finish learning the rest of the song, hopefully tomorrow if I have time. We'll see. Eric the Bread and Cobra Commander, before I forget, are you both moderators? If not that you have to feel obligated to like be working when you're watching the streams, because y'all both watch these streams frequently. But just so you have the ability to mute people or whatever. Since you're here a lot. There you go. Now you're both moderators. Let me know if you're ever here on Twitch, and I'll make you a Twitch moderator too. On Twitch, but not on YouTube. Gotcha. China Talk. Hello, Doug. Are you a frequent viewer of the show, Doug? I don't know if I recognize your username, but happy to have you. Did you just post the pot from... What is that? It looks like a character from Dark Souls, Elden Ring. You're cool with that, Eric? Very cool, very cool. Good, 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 good. Good. So who, I don't know who sent me this video. Actually, I can check because it's in our Discord. By the way, folks, join the Midwestern Marx Discord. It is certainly a whole lot of fun. Sorry, I'm generating a link to send you all. But someone sent me this video, China, Socialism or Capitalist Social Imperialism, and it's from an outlet that's Marxist-Leninist. So it's not like Marxist-Leninist Maoist, which you would expect to be like an ultra outlet criticizing China, you know. But this is Marxist-Leninist. And they're taking, you know, what I would criticize as an ultra position against China. One sec. Let me share the stream to the Discord too, now that I'm thinking about it. Just so we can maximize our comrades who see this video that I spent all of my Saturday planning out. It's going to be worth it, though. It's a good video. Great show we got planned for y'all. I promise you. All right. Shared the Discord. Yeah. Share our Twitch. Boom. And then... Oh, yeah. I already shared the Discord invite link with you all. Here it is again, in case I accidentally changed it there. All right. Hello. Oh, let me put these out on Instagram. I mean, sorry, Twitter too. Not Instagram. After I tweet the links for our streams out to Twitter, we will get started. How's everybody doing? Do people have questions, things they want to talk about, news stories they want to bring up? I'll talk to the chat or answer questions or anything like that before we jump into reacting to today's video, which I have like a whole ass script written up for. Because I want to dissect this video point by point. It's interesting. You will see what I mean when we play the video. Channel, that's what I want. Live on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, LOL. Some people watch on Facebook. Some people like it. No shame if you watch on Facebook. Shout out to the Facebook audience. A lot of older people on Facebook. You know, we don't have a large audience over there, but they're loyal. They're loyal people over on Facebook. I'm talking about Facebook like it's ancient. Loyal folk over there at Facebook. Other than that darn Zuckerberg. All right, sharing the YouTube live on Twitter. Almost done, folks. Sorry I'm taking so long. There's got to be an easier way to do this. I'm sure there is, but I'll figure it out next time. Today, I spent all my time writing this video, and now I was really eager to talk about it with y'all. Even though I've got some technical kinks I could have worked out with the stream today. Priorities. Alrighty. Now we are ready to roll. Look at that, 36 viewers. Look how many viewers we increased. People in the chat, let me know if you're here from TikTok. Let me know if you're here from TikTok, because I just made a TikTok. I thought it was a good one. Sometimes I aim the TikToks just at pure education. Sometimes they're just for me, where I'm talking about something that I'm learning about, and I just want to talk about it to help me understand it better and to discuss it with other people and teach it if I can, because you learn through teaching. But sometimes I just try and make a TikTok go viral. Like I'll sometimes aiming at going viral. And that's not to say I don't have any substance in it. I still say stuff I believe in my principles. But I try and do my delivery in a way that's short and concise and sometimes funny and usually ends in under a minute to try and get on people's FYP. So I posted one like that and then left in the comments. We're streaming on Twitch and YouTube. And I'm trying to find what the best way to get our audience from TikTok over onto YouTube and Twitch is. So I want to test out how well that works. So if you have any suggestions, also let me know. And if you're here from TikTok, please let me know. China had good economic growth even before 1978. Yes, thank you. That's something we're going to talk about today too. We're going to talk about the economic growth under Mao and the increase in standard of living under Mao, how that was brought about, how it looks different than China under Deng with the market reforms, but how the market reforms that were enacted under Deng Xiaoping, which are often seen in separation and isolation from the productive base late in the era of Mao Zedong. We're going to see how those two eras sort of work together and how the economy of Mao helped create the possibility for the later economy with the market reforms. Sorry, I'm finishing up the last little thing I need to do here. And then we will get started. Copy. Alrighty. Let's see if anyone has any questions in the chat here. Actually, we should check our Reddit too. As I said, I'm going to do that every time now. I've said that a million times. I never do, but. Hello, tell me what you know about Tiananmen Square. Not that much, but you can watch Danny Haifong. He knows a lot more about it than me. Watch him on Jimmy Dore. There's a good write-up on it from Chow Collective. That I can send you. That's pretty good. And also Chow Collective does a reading list of stuff to read to understand Tiananmen Square, not from U.S. propaganda lens. So I just sent it to you. Sorry for shaking my camera. I was leaning on my desk, even though I set up a different desk to prevent that from happening. Oh, look at that. $2 from, what is that, New Zealand? Tom McIntyre. Greetings from New Zealand, Comrade Lager. Greetings, Tom. Thank you so much for the super chat. Thank you for your support. That's awesome. I love seeing the international support. I feel like doing this stuff online, starting the website and trying to do online education has allowed me to meet people from so many different places, like all over the world. Actually, I gotta one sec. So you got people from New Zealand. Obviously, we have a patron who's at every Patreon Zoom hangout that we do. From Australia. They never miss a book club or a Zoom hangout. And then someone sent me his currency from the Central Bank of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is money from Venezuela. República Bolivariana de Venezuela. And then this is more from Iran. So I can't remember. One guy sent me all of this. I can't remember where he was from, but I feel like I've met people from all over. I've talked to people who participated in the revolution in Libya, which was a U.S.-backed NATO intervention, and infiltration, covert infiltration as well. I've even had Zoom chats with people from the IDF, which is the Israeli Occupation Forces, which that was before I really knew. I was an anti-imperialist, but I wasn't a firm Marxist with strong principles in a lot of different areas. And I knew what I thought about Palestine, but I was still learning, and these people from the IDF were so convinced that they were correct, and that Palestine was evil and they were doing the right thing, which, if you've interacted with Zionists, that's just how they are. They'll justify literally anything the Israeli occupation forces do. We pointed it out the other day. The occupation forces had killed a bunch of children, 5-year-old children. Then I had all these comments from people saying, oh, these Palestinians were planning jihad and they were planning an attack on Israel. It was justified. It's like, these 5-year-old kids. You think 5-year-old kids were planning an attack on the Israeli government, which gets billions of dollars a year from the U.S. and access to, the U.S.'s weapons contractors and their high-tech weaponry versus Palestine, who at times, the resistance has literally used high-powered fireworks. It's just ridiculous. But yeah, so these people, they convinced me to do a Zoom chat. And, even at that mildly educated point in time in my life, which I had already gotten my degree in political science, so I knew more than the average schmo, but, definitely not as much as I know now. Talking to them, though, made me more anti-IDF, made me more pro-Palestine, because it was crazy how fast they devolved into, they're just inherently violent. The Palestinians are all extremists and terrorists. We have to do this. We're doing the world a favor by making, when I brought up the fact that 75% of Palestinian people are refugees because of the Israeli occupation. This is racist, imperialistic rhetoric. It actually reminded me of talking to like old school American conservatives, like not necessarily Trump people, but old school like George Bush supporters who supported the U.S. military and U.S. neoconservatism, neoconservative ideology of just endless expansionism and interventionism and fighting the war on terror and ramping it up. The John Bolton, Mike Pompeo ideology. Which coincidentally was in the Trump White House, even though Trump was talking about ending the wars, which shows how Trump was a charlatan. But talking to the IDF reminded me of talking to them, which ironically, Mike Pompeo, or maybe not ironically, Mike Pompeo is evangelical Christian, hardcore ideological supporter of Israel, as well as a material supporter of Israel when he's been in government, obviously. And just the way that you could talk to people like supporters of the Iraq War, and it was like, well, Iraq was going to attack us, and Saddam didn't have WMDs, but he could have made WMDs, And that therefore it's not a big deal that the government lied to us and said Saddam had nukes in order to attack them, which is something that they, information that they gained by torturing people. The Zionists were the same way. Like, well, but you guys killed children. They'll be like, well, the children were gonna attack us first. The Palestinians are so evil, they might, strap bombs to children, so we have to airstrike them before they do it. Just ridiculous stuff. So yeah, don't be afraid to talk to everyone. The sign of an intelligent mind is being able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Don't be afraid to talk with everyone and learn from everyone, even if it means learning that, oh, I do not trust these people or like these people or agree with their ideology, or I think they're racist apartheid enforcers in some cases. Also from New Zealand. Nice. How do you feel about Andrew Tate? Obviously, he sucks. Obviously, he's misogynistic, but his dad was in the CIA, which, that's not me saying that Andrew Tate's a CIA agent. I don't think he is, but his dad was in the CIA, and I think he's seen the corruption and sort of evil of the U.S. empire, because his dad was in the CIA, an intelligence agency which enforces Western imperialism and is known for being one of the more brutal agencies or institutions which does so. So he's talking about, I've heard him tell his followers, don't join the military. You're just going to throw your life away killing kids in Yemen. All right, which is good advice. I mean, not to make anyone who's been in the military or is dealing with PTSD, which is something we're going to talk about today, not to make anyone feel bad or worse. You can recover and now fight against the U.S. empire and fight against the institutions which send young Americans to fight and die in war. But Andrew Tate says stuff like that, but then, he's obviously not pointing people towards socialism or working class organization. He's saying get rich, chase money, chase women, and treat women like objects. And he's literally pushing this sort of ideology that Kristen Godseed talks about in her book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And there are books which talk about this ideology more in depth. And that's just one that I know talks about it. But Andrew Tate pushes this ideology of seeing the dating world, seeing sex in general as a market transaction, right? What do you have to offer me? Men are valuable if they have money, if they have wealth, if they own capital. They make themselves more. They by adding money and wealth and power and control, demand for them goes up in the dating market, and there's less supply of guys like that. So what Kristen Godseed does in her book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, is looks at former Soviet countries like, East Germany and others, and looks at what dating was like, and also compares East Germany and West Germany, because then you can compare the same time period, capitalism versus socialism. And what she finds is that East German women, or German in the former Soviet states, socialist states, dated men less based on their wealth and more based on their personality. And they were more willing to divorce or leave the relationships that were abusive, where they were experiencing domestic abuse, because they weren't economically tied to their husband then as the main wage earner. And they weren't seeking out husbands based on, trying to find economic stability, trying to find somebody who can support them economically. So they say it actually made dating a lot better. And obviously, Andrew Tate isn't pointing to stuff like that. He's enforcing this, you just need to be the ultimate man, the best man ever, rise above everything, make all this money, and then only find a woman who's worthy of you. And it's like a perverted form of masculinity, I guess, taken to toxic levels. Because I do think there's a crisis of identity and sort of masculinity and authenticity in our society. And China has done these programs to maintain masculinity among young boys. and not in this toxic sense, but just in, having confidence and having the ability to work on your own thing and do your own thing without basing your entire self-worth on girls and really how you look and how you are within this, or how you look to other people within this dating market. Instead of worrying about how high is the demand for me, how many girls want me, how can I make myself attractive to others, focus on yourself, develop strong principles, and develop a good community of people around you, good relationships. And eventually, if you continue to do that, you can find, a partner. I mean, you have to be able to love yourself and be, have your own values established and have your own interests, and then find someone who's also interested in that. So basically, I'm saying date someone who has your values, not somebody who has high demand within this dating market that's all based on money, and how much you own, like Andrew Tate. So when he criticizes imperialism, I like it. But I talk about him some because I'm trying to get his fans to come over to me. If you want to have masculinity, come be a Marxist and fight against the empire and fight against capitalism. And it's not going to be toxic masculinity. Part of masculinity is respecting women and being secure enough in yourself to not be a jealous little man baby. And like there are other points where, where Andrew Tate criticizes gender ideology and it makes he accidentally says something that I agree with, right? Because there are, critiques to be made of gender ideology as a theory. But I also think he's just plain misogynistic and plain wrong in the way that he sees the world. Hi, Eddie. Hello, Petamio. Welcome back. Giga Chad Gamma Mail. Yeah, baby. That's me, though. Andrew Tate fans, come join wrestling and read about Marx. Polistern is just a nonsense that doesn't understand anything about Marxist philosophy. Okay. So who is this Polistern? Does anybody know anything about Polistern? The channel who made the video we're going to react to today? Dang it, why is my screen not sharing anymore? So I spent a little bit of time researching them today. Actually, you could say more than a little bit. Polistern International, they have a website. They're MLs, but they're anti-China. Which is like, I don't get how you can be an ML in the modern day and be against the largest, wealthiest ML state in the world or country in the world, and one of the most powerful and economically stable countries in the world, period, who the UN just recognized their total alleviation of poverty. I can look at that as an ML and be like, this sucks, unless there's either some kind of gap in their understanding of theory and Marxism-Leninism, or, it could be something nefarious, like some sort of corporate influence or psyop. But I don't want to accuse them of that because that's not what it seems like. It seems like they're genuine, which, honestly, it's nice that there's enough Marxist-Leninists out there now, to the point where we can be criticizing each other and doing good faith critiques, because that did not used to be the case. It was, the internet was flooded with anarchists and ancoms, but hi, I've been loving your content. I've just been quiet. No problem, Jill. Thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying the content. Feel free to speak up. I promise everyone in here is nice. And if people are mean to you, then we throw them out because we got good mods in here. Have you spoke on the Caleb Maupin drama? Eventually. We're gonna have an editorial board meeting about it because obviously we've published his work before and worked with him, so we got to figure out what we're going to do going forward. But I'll let y'all know in a professional way. He's right, though, about how most parts of the world still adhere by those rules. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point, I guess. Andrew Tate just isn't criticizing that system or saying we need to move towards, a different system. He's saying, be a beast within this really messed up, misogynistic, patriarchal, money-hungry system. It's like, no, that's not what it means to be a man. A man means you never give up in the fight for socialism. Andrew Tate. That's what a man means. Show you what a man means, Andrew Tate. Where's the volume?
You never give up. Gotta tough it up in your heart. Tough it up, man. A man means you never give up. Gotta tough it up in your heart. Tough it.
This is Che Guevara talking to Fidel Castro before the revolution, saying that we need to make this a communist, anti-imperialist, Marxist-Leninist revolution. Fidel was a nationalist at first, anti-colonialist, before it became a Marxist-Leninist revolution and became the great Cuban Revolution that we know today. And this was Che and Fidel when Che was telling him to make it Marxist.
A man. A man means you never give up. Gotta tough it up in your heart. Tough it up, man. A man means.
Boom. So, anyone know anything about Polistern? That's when I knew Polistern was a bad actor. Oh, I remember in his revisionist and opportunist videos, he shows a video of Carlos in it, implying you guys are revisionists or opportunists. Oh, really? That'd be funny to react to. I have not seen that. Or maybe it's this video and I just missed it when I was watching. I don't think so. An ML who listens to Adrian Zenz. Yeah. Yeah, maybe they're more nefarious than I thought. An ML anti-China is a clown. You ain't wrong. You ain't totally wrong. I mean, if people are anti-China because they're genuinely confused, we'll help them. But, like, these guys have a Marxist-Leninist website. Look at this. Look, I mean, they have news. They publish articles from the U.S. and internationally. They have theory, politics, history, agitation. They're prevalent on every social media. Like, I mean, if you have the confidence to make a video about China and their revolution and whether they're socialist, you should really, really know your stuff and know what they're talking about. And they clearly didn't in this video. So even if they are not nefarious, or connected, even if they are good faith actors and they are genuine Marxist-Leninists, they need to be criticized for this hard, because this is unacceptable. Polistrum is not worth considering. They've been on the wrong track from the get-go. Trotskyites may have served the purpose of enrolled in the 90s, and sticking to this line I was irrational. And they're not even Trots. I was reading their articles about Trotsky. They're anti-Trotsky. So, because that's what I thought. I'm like, these guys just sound like Trots, right? They're Marxists, and some of their theoretical analysis is good. But then they just don't support socialism in reality, because it's never good enough. It's never a good enough permanent revolution or whatever. But then these guys are anti-Trotsky and they're Marxist-Leninists, which just confuses me. And they support the Soviet Union, but not China. I was like, what? How does that work? Because, I mean, this is an oversimplification, because China says Stalin was 70% right, 30% wrong. But the Sino-Soviet split happened when Khrushchev went away from Stalin and denounced Stalin. And then China liked Stalin, and they still like Stalin. And they, went with a more Stalinist line. So if you're Marxist-Leninist, like if you support Lenin and Stalin was the first person to talk about Marxism, Leninism as a specific ideology, then how are you anti-China? Because China mostly went the way of Lenin. So the revisionist MLs, yeah, I just haven't dealt with revisionist MLs much. But we will discuss this. I got to move my script over here to this screen, because I wrote up a whole script for this bad boy. But yeah, they talk about social imperialism in this video, which I'm pretty sure the term social imperialism itself originated in China. as a criticism of the Soviet Union and Khrushchev and like what they did in Afghanistan. So yeah, that's why I was a little confused by Polistern being MLs, because usually that's a Maoist, Marxist-Leninist Maoist talking point or argument against the Soviet Union, but these guys are in favor of the Soviet Union, and they still use that. This video has a lot of views compared to how many subscribers they have. I guess it's been around since 2019. I guess I didn't know it was that old. Wow. Interesting. But maybe there's a bunch of negative comments. I don't know. But I'm always skeptical, like when a video has a lot of views compared to the amount of subscribers, just because, like, you know, it's been proven now that the State Department boosts certain content with like bots, you know, what we call astroturfing their preferred content. And there was some video a while back coming after all the anti-imperialists and Marxist-Leninists and calling us all conspiracy theorists by that account Sophie from Mars, which is like a synthetic leftist sort of bread tube account, pseudo-Marxist account. They're like, you know, all the anti-imperialists are just crazy conspiracy theorists, and the account didn't have that many subscribers, but the video got just like hundreds of thousands of views. Like, there's no way that's natural. So that was my first thought when I saw this, but now that I know that it's from 2019, maybe not. So yeah. Let me go get some water. And then I'll be back to start the video. I just want to say to the Polistrum people, if they're watching this, the people who run Polistrum International, if they're still around, still kicking, I'd be happy to come on your stream and debate these positions or discuss these positions, or even have you on ours. So yeah, BRB. All right. I don't know why I always forget to bring water. It's like I'm streaming. I have to be talking the whole time. Why would I not bring water? All right. Either way, without further ado, Polistern International, China, Socialism or Capitalism. Let's roll.
We hear a lot about the strength of China, about the rapid growth of its economy, and its rising importance in the world. Once a poorly developed agrarian country, dependent on imperial has the world's largest industry.
What the heck just happened? My screen stopped sharing. That's annoying. Got it. All right.
Advanced scientific and technical achievements, and the most numerous armies in the world. Chinese factories produce a lot of different things which are consumed by the rest of the world, and some companies' industries are almost fully situated in China. The labor of the Chinese workers is not only hard, but sometimes puts workers' lives in danger. Residents of Chinese provinces who manage to find a job in a city often become victims of arbitrariness and lawlessness, and even suicide, unable to withstand the frantic work pace at Chinese factories.
So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Because In 2002, the rate of suicide in China was 6.15 to every 100,000 people. And that decreased between 2002 and 2020 to 5.1 out of 100,000 people. So, overall, the suicide rates have been decreasing. And overall, there was a decrease, but there was a bigger decrease between 2002 and 2009, right? And that trend reversed slightly. And the suicide rate just rose a little bit, or the decreasing suicide rate plateaued between 2009 and 2020. So some American researchers have framed this, as a trend of increasing suicide, even though it's an overall decrease, which can, and it's still concerning, and we want suicide rates to progressively go down every year if possible. But it's just interesting how American researchers are able to frame an overall decrease in suicide as an increase in suicide, but just singling out the years where suicide was increased. But yeah, so 5.1 out of every 100,000. Like I said, it's concerning. We want to get that down to 0. But let's compare that to the U.S., the capitalist neoliberal United States. The suicide rates in the U.S. in 2020 were 13.48 people to every 100,000, so over twice as high as China's, and that's over 130 people per day. In 2001, there were 29,580 per year in that year total. And then in 2019, there were 45,861. So the suicide rate got much, much higher. Total suicides increased by at least about 33, 35%. Probably more than that, actually. But yeah. And even more sad, and kind of to also talk about one of the root causes of this, and point to imperialism and capitalism as a cause of depression and even suicide. 6,261 of the suicides in 2019 were veterans. So 13.7% of all U.S. suicides were veterans. And in 2001, it was 20.2%. And there were 5,989. Mostly veterans who were 55 to 74 years old in 2001. So veterans who were in the imperialist war against Vietnam, where the U.S. forced the troops to do a lot of horrific things, leaving tons of people with PTSD, and then giving them little to no help when they get back home. And we're seeing the same thing today. So right in 2001, when we were experiencing a high number of veteran suicides because people were coming back from Vietnam, people were experiencing PTSD from Vietnam. The U.S. started the war in Afghanistan, and then a few years later started the war in Iraq, sending a whole new batch of young people to fight and die for capitalist imperialism, leaving them with PTSD. And then we have the U.S. Pointing at China then and being like, look at their high suicide rate, which is less than half of ours. Let's do something about that. Let's send troops over there. We need to intervene. That's not what Polistern, these guys, the people who made the video, are saying. But they're parroting the same talking points of the U.S. State Department, who wants to help China by starting a new intervention. That's what NATO said in their recent summit. Their new goal is to target Russia and China. So yeah, it's a joke that China are the ones who have this suicide and depression problem. It is a problem, and it's up to their people and their government and their system to try and combat that problem. But it's twice as much of a problem here in the U.S. because we're shipping people overseas to fight and die in these ridiculous wars for capitalist expansion. And then when they come home, we don't treat them for PTSD or the programs that the military offers for PTSD and mental health and various benefits are really hard to access and are hidden, and the military personnel aren't educated on how to access these various programs that are available to them. That's a major problem that my friend who's a social worker with former veterans tells me about. There's a lot of a lot of programs available, or the U.S. gives a lot of lip service to helping veterans, but then those programs are very hard to access, and the vets aren't educated on how to get to them. But yeah, and then people come home from these imperialist wars, and it's romanticized by Hollywood entertainment media propaganda. And that's why Hollywood spends millions the DoD spends millions and millions of dollars influencing movie studios in Hollywood, because you have movies like American Sniper, where there's literally a scene in that movie where his wife is like, "You don't have to go back, Chris. Like, don't go back to war. Stay with me and our kid. Stay with our family." And he goes, "Oh, and wait for them to come here and get us?" He's talking about Syria and Iraq. I'm pretty sure Chris Kyle spent some time in Yemen. So we have the media glorifying these people who go overseas and fight in these wars, who are clearly, psychologically disturbed and institutionalized in the military to the point where they only feel comfortable when they're going overseas and are at war. That's romanticized. He's the good guy. He's the hero. He fought for his country. And kids expect kids in high school talking to their recruiters, not expect to be just like Chris Kyle, but they're naive about what they're actually going into. And then we have this massive suicide rate in the U.S. I found this today when I was researching this topic, because I just find this stuff super interesting. Like, the DoD funding of Call of Duty is so interesting to me. And this is the Department of Defense website. Bradley Cooper, star of American Sniper, speaks at the Navy Memorial. Why he cares so much about service members. Ugh, I'm gonna puke. Talks about why he cares so much about service members and why he chose this role as Chris Kyle. He cares so much about service members that he's going to do propaganda to create more of them, so we can send young kids to get PTSD and fight for oil in Iraq, so our suicide rate can climb even higher. Screw you, Bradley Cooper. One time I was on the way home from a movie with my friend, and we got pulled over by a cop. And for some reason, my friend was super nervous, and we were on our way back from our friend's house. We actually weren't even on our way home from a movie. I don't know if I said that or not, but this cop pulls us over for going like 6 over the speed limit. And then it's like, "What are you guys doing?" And my friend's like, "Oh, just going home." And then he opens his glove compartment, and like a can of dip, like chewing tobacco, fell out, and a condom. And the cop's like, "Are those yours? Your condom and your dip?" Like, said it in a threatening way, as if the dip would have been illegal. I think we were 17, but a condom? Why are you giving us crap about a condom? And then the cop went back, and eventually my friend was like, or the cop asked, "What were you guys doing tonight?" My friend was like, "Oh, coming home from a movie." He lied to the cop for some reason. I'm like, why didn't we just tell him we on our way home from our friends? I thought it was weird, but then the cop's like, "You see Sniper?" Talking about American Sniper. My friend's like, yeah, my friend had actually just seen the movie. I hadn't. The cop's like, "It's a great one. I love that. Yeah, Chris Kyle's a hero. All right, have a good night, boys." And he let us go. So, moral of the story, if you ever want to get away from a cop, just talk about some movie that's actually just DoD propaganda. All right, let's continue with this.
Ensuring the growth of living standards that remain low and very uneven in China has been a long-lasting priority of the country's leadership. However, for whom do the workers at Chinese factories work, and can honest work really save them from lawlessness and poverty? In 1978, Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms were undertaken in China. They noted the transition of the country's economy to a market economy system.
Okay, every economy has markets, and every economy exchanges goods. In Mao's China, It was just that the markets were mostly controlled by the state. The state was like the only substantial buyer and seller out of necessity, because they were mostly feudal economy before that. They were agrarian. They needed the development of markets at all, some kind of market, and they needed eventually the development of their productive forces. And what they did was they used the agricultural surplus to industrialize and make steel, which was then, could then be used to industrialize and collectivize agriculture. So after they had industry, they were able to take industrial tools into the fields and produce much, much more food. It made China self-sufficient in food production. So the state basically owned the bulk of the industry and the agriculture, and just traded those commodities with other state-run institutions based on the economic plans of construction that had been laid out through theorizing, discussing, debating within the party and among the people. And people also, still bought and sold and traded commodities among themselves in local markets, especially later on in the development after China's productive forces and their industrialization process had gotten underway, and increased commodity exchange and commodity production in general. There was a lot more trading and exchanging of commodities and economic activity among the people and amongst themselves. A lot more producing of, I guess, specialized goods or specialized commodities by the people. So we did a video about the construction of modern China and their struggle against imperialism, which
Velcro factory direct.
people can check this out if they want. If they want to see something in depth about this subject and the construction of China under Mao. But basically, what you have to understand is that Mao industrialized the country and laid a base, an economic base, and started some market activity, which then allowed for Deng Xiaoping's market reforms in specific financial zones on top of the base that had been laid by Mao. So the socialist construction that was underwent under Mao wasn't, negated by Deng Xiaoping. It was deepened. So it's not that socialist countries don't have markets, or some people say Marx just didn't understand supply and demand. It's that they have more planned and controlled markets which are designed to benefit people. And they have various mechanisms in place to ensure that goods and services are distributed more rationally and that people can get their means of subsistence. By example, China allows a lot of people to have land plots where they can, garden or basically grow food, have mini farms and grow their own means of subsistence, make themselves more self-sufficient and less dependent on the food production of others or of markets. There's the party cadres. So, China comes up with these central economic plans, like their poverty alleviation programs. And then there are party cadres, part of the 95 million members who make up the Communist Party of China, who are in charge of every area and of every city. And they make sure that these areas are hitting certain economic goals, certain productive goals, and they make sure that the people's needs are met, and that technology is advancing there. So back in the day, it was, trying to get people food, water, shelter, and then also making sure that industrialization was being carried out. That's what the cadres were in charge of, teaching people how to use steel and how to produce steel, how to use steel tools. Because keep in mind, these people were peasants for years and years and years and years. They didn't have a capitalist economy prior to the socialist revolution. So back in the day, the cadres did that, and as time progressed, what the cadres did progressed. So now, they ensure that everybody in China has Wi-Fi, and access to, internet, higher standard of living than back in the day. I guess Wi-Fi is a good example, right? So they have expanded telecommunications, and what the party tries to bring people and the way the party supports people and negates the negative effects of the markets, the capitalistic markets that they have. are constantly changing and evolving and modernizing.
As a political rival to the Soviet Union, Red China changed its colors. The new government made deals with Western investors on placement of foreign monopolies industries on its territory. The countries of the capitalist West willingly transferred their industries to China, where the cost of labor was minimal at that time. Forgetting the meaning behind its own name, the Chinese Communist Party paved the way for foreign capital that poured into the country and actually rented out a sizable part of the working population of the country. Due to stratification in the countryside, socialist collective farms and villages were destroyed, and millions of people were ready to work in factories for a meager wage. In 2010, the number of unemployed in China was estimated at 200 million people. The number of Chinese workers has been increasing because of migration from poor villages. At the same time, the majority of the Chinese population works on family farms or lives in urban ghettos where their rights are often violated. State officials become capitalists who are appointed by party clans, and the developing socialist society turned into corrupt state capitalist society. In 2001, it was announced that the CPC would welcome entrepreneurs into its ranks. The number of workers and farmers in the National People's Congress decreased from 51.1% in 1975 to less than 4% in 2003. The stratification of Chinese society has amounted to great figures that are comparable to the most backward capitalist countries. China has recently moved ahead of the United States in terms of the number of dollar billionaires. Today, there are $819 billionaires and more than $1 million millionaires in China.
So the analysis of the market reforms isn't terrible compared to the rest of the video, and Western analysts usually do a better job at talking about this period in China's history when Deng Xiaoping opened up to foreign markets in specific zones. Because at that point in time, China was moving in a more capitalist or more liberal direction. They just were. The party understood this, and it was part of modernizing so they could eventually build socialism, but it was a move towards the right or more towards capitalism. And with these reforms, because the US was making so much money in China by investing in China, they stopped doing China evil, communist, bad propaganda and started doing China are reformed, good capitalist, good guys now propaganda. But the thing that Western analysts always miss, though, the part that I've never, ever, ever seen a Western analyst talk about is what somebody just brought up in the chat. Shout out to our educated chat. But the specific financial zones or the special financial zones. So the party and the government and the cadres looked at the the base that had been laid by Mao. They looked at Chinese society and their existing economy, and they selected special financial zones, carefully selected them, and placed these zones on top of the state and local markets that existed already, and the industrial and base of agricultural food production that had been laid by Mao, increased food production. And the goal in these reforms and in these special financial zones was not to abolish or wipe out what the base that had been laid by Mao, which is how it's often described and looked at in the West, is just a turn towards capitalism and a move away from socialism. But it was to deepen what Mao had done and modernize China. And yeah, at this point they industrialized, and they created cities. That's what happened with the market reforms. And this video's acting like that is evil. But what do you think happened during the period of industrialization in the US or in Europe during the period of capitalist industrialization? Right? They went through a process of socialist industrialization, which leads people, to leave the countryside and go into the cities in search of industrial jobs. And, this video's like, oh, there are people, stacked up in apartments in the Chinese cities now. Like, what do you call the projects in the U.S.? In China's homelessness rates are very, very low versus even in the wealthiest cities in the U.S., there's people sleeping on the streets. That's capitalism. Not that Polistern is pro-capitalism, but, there's a major difference in what China's industrialization looked like compared to the U.S. Like, how do you think Chicago came about? People were going for industrial jobs in the cities, especially people who were fleeing the racist South, which was also mostly the agricultural and more poor South, compared to the booming industrialized North. And overcrowding is a side effect of that, and it is a problem, especially in a country of over 1 billion people like China. And they've constantly been taking steps to combat that, like the one-child policy, which was to prevent starvation and legitimate overcrowding and overconsumption until China's productive forces had been increased to a certain level. And now and then they repealed the one-child policy. But they did things to combat the overcrowding that comes about with industrialization. Meanwhile, the U.S. just allowed people to be homeless. There's a lot of pictures of the Industrial Revolution, how people lived, how the working class lived. Whole families jammed into like basements in New York, or like multiple families in one floor in these apartments. Just the worst living conditions as they were being worked ragged, like 12 hours a day. So industrialization in socialist China, even with their market reforms and the ill effects of allowing some private markets in the country, has looked way more humane than industrialization in the U.S. and Europe, which was also dependent on the American South's cotton market, created by the mass torture and import of slaves. So this video, the Polistern video, also mentions family farms. He's talking about how most Chinese people are family farmers. And I think he's talking about the land plots that are given to the people by the government and that are protected from speculating banks and corporations by the government. And as I said earlier, this allows people to grow their own food and thus their own means of subsistence. Thus, they're less dependent on the markets. They're less dependent on agricultural corporations or the Agricultural Bank of China. It gives them long-term sustainability and self-sufficiency, as well as leading to poverty reduction because they're creating their own food. So they have to spend less money on food in the market. So, you can criticize that and say, oh, China hasn't done socialism. All their people are just family farmers still. But especially in a country of 1.3 billion people where you're trying to get rid of poverty, allowing people to grow their own food and have their own land plots that are protected from speculators and corporations is a great idea. And this is also what I mean by China hasn't just allowed markets to come in and run roughshod over everything and over everything that had been established under Mao. There are protections in place to maintain the local economy and to protect the workers from corporate speculation. And that's one of the examples. And also, I think people misunderstand Lenin. And I'm going back to this because Polistern, the creators we're reacting to right now, say they're Marxist-Leninists. Lenin said we have to work side by side with the capitalists, or he said we're going to have to learn to do that because we have to learn their tricks of the trade. And the tactics and the technology that they use for running industry, at least the ones that will remain useful in a socialist or transitional society, right? We have to negate the parts that are bad and the ill effects of how capitalists run industry and do it to exploit people to the max. But then we also have to learn like the technical side of it. How do they do administration? How do they manage and organize all that cooperative labor between these giant groups of workers? And how can we do that better? How can we do the administration in a more socialistic ground up way? But how can we also increase productivity in these various industries? So yeah, and this guy says that the Communist Party forgot its name, becoming state capitalist. But socialism is state capitalism. Socialism is literally when you take the state away from the capitalists, and then you start using the state on behalf of the workers to establish a real political democracy and establish a socialist economy. So because every new economic system bears the birthmarks of the old system, that's a Karl Marx quote, socialism is going to be state capitalism until it can, progress to a higher stage. And China is trying to modernize and develop and keep pace with the US or outpace them, the imperialist US. Um, so they need some giant expansive industries, and they need some sort of access to these global markets, these global capitalist markets, where especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, most the material wealth in the world was. Now you could say most of the material wealth in the world is created in China. But back then that wasn't the case. So yes, if they're going to have these global corporations in their country, or these giant expansive companies invested in their country, they want Communist Party members and cadres on the boards of those companies or meeting with those companies to help make decisions, so they can influence the decisions in favor of the people and the party and the centralized economic plans. Like, imagine if the Communist Party took power in the US tomorrow. Like, putting Communist Party members on the board of Twitter would be a great idea. We could make it so that Twitter would have to set up profit sharing, right? So that not all their money is going to shareholders. We could democratically create terms of service for Twitter. Make Twitter a less hierarchical structure. Make Twitter less biased. Right now, they only give blue check marks if you're a pro-imperialist liberal. Putting Communist Party members on the boards of these big corporations during a transition out of capitalism is just a good idea, right? That's a good way to control them and use them for the people's ends, because, you can't just wipe them out, obliterate them on day one, especially if you're China and you have to modernize your country and build yourself out of a feudal agrarian society while combating the modernized US empire every step of the way. And they knew that the market reforms and opening up to private capital in these special zones would lead to an increase in corruption. Deng Xiaoping and all of his theoretical allies within the party knew this would happen before they did the market reforms. And there were some rough times in China, and the markets definitely, and the bourgeoisie definitely did try and take control of the party. But there have been so many efforts within China to combat this. And, as I said, the Communist Party has 95 million members who are dedicated to building socialism. They're not just going to let the bourgeoisie take over. And the anti-corruption efforts that have recently been carried out by Xi Jinping have combated corruption quite well, really well, actually. I mean, it's rooted so much corruption out of the party. And at the same time, they've enacted their anti-poverty programs, ramped up their anti-poverty programs, really, which did a lot to alleviate the ill effects of that capital and the capitalist markets, alleviating the corruption that comes along when you have a larger and more wealthy bourgeoisie, and alleviating some of the inequality that just comes about as you're developing and modernizing. People just don't read what the Chinese theorists actually say, right? They just project their own analysis on China, rather than reading what China is actually doing, or the debate within China. There's a constant recalibration of how they're constructing socialism based on their inner party and inner country debate. And the decrease of workers within the party is bad. I think they took a stat from like 2001 or 2002, which was sort of like the peak of China's like liberal or capitalized state after the market reforms. But again, there have been massive anti-corruption efforts to keep the party grounded in the working class. And yes, I just want to say an early socialist society can have billionaires in the modern era. An early stage socialist society, obviously under communism, trying to abolish money and stuff. But right now, China is modernizing. In China, money doesn't equal power the same way it does in the US. because the people and the party and the country's plans for modernization and development come before the billionaires, right? So billionaires in China symbolize wealth, and an increase in modernization and overall strength for their country. Billionaires in the U.S. are oligarchs. Billionaires in the U.S. don't have their companies controlled by their party and regulated by the party. The billionaires control the state and use it to suppress the workers. The billionaires are oligarchs who can use their money to control the party. And there are exaggerated Western articles that try and make China out to look crazy, when it comes to like executing billionaires and stuff. But especially during the anti-corruption efforts of Xi Jinping, there have been billionaires executed in China. If you're caught being corrupt and working against the people and working against socialism and working against the security of China, even if you're a billionaire, even if you have all that money, they'll kill you. And that right there is the main difference between China's billionaires and the US billionaires. Right? China's billionaires are scared of the party and they're scared of the state. And they're scared of the people. US billionaires mock and suppress the people, and the state is their puppet.
In response to reproaches of the communist, Deng Xiaoping noticed that he was not interested in the color of the cat if it catches mice. The Chinese authority is not really interested in how they get their wealth, but the same can't be said about the working people. The profits of the overexploitation of Chinese workers go into the accounts of Western companies and large Chinese banks in order to subsequently reinvest in the assets of monopolies of the capitalists. Meanwhile, the social sector of Chinese society, like in the rest of the world, is undergoing reforms and monetization. Any available services are rapidly being privatized, appropriated by growing financial capital, and turned into services.
Sorry if the audio was bad there. I forgot to turn off my microphone before I hit play. But capitalists and Western monopolies have made a lot of money off China, and it was technically exploitation. And there were sections of the party and people within China who were against it every step of the way. Like I said, a lot of Marxist-Leninist Maoist sort of ultra ideas that we criticize as being ultra left, originated in China, like social imperialism being an example. That originated as a critique of the Soviet Union from China. Okay, sorry. I thought my page was crashing. But those academics in China always had substantive critiques of what was going on. They weren't naive about what China was actually doing in trying to increase their industrial base and deepen the industrial development that had happened under Mao and become more self-sufficient while combating imperialism, right? They don't have these naive critiques of it like Westerners do, where they're just like, China's corrupt and evil and they don't care about socialism anymore. And there are, certain services that are still privatized within China. But again, being private doesn't mean the same thing when all these private companies have boards that are controlled by Communist Party members, right? And when there's all these government regulations on what private industries have to do. Oh, dang it. My notes did crash. All right, now I got to find where I'm at again. Sorry. Sorry. I have a bunch of notes. Uh-oh, the cops are here. They're gonna arrest me for being a communist. So yeah, even the private sector in China is still mostly adherent to the government and the party and the central plans. And also the party that's made up of 95 million members is separate from the government. Right? They have a lot of representatives in the government. They're the ruling party in the government, but there are other parties in the government and other interests. And the 95 million members of the Communist Party are connected and made up of the people, the masses, the theoretically educated, socialist-minded masses of China. So, even if you disagree with what the Chinese government has done in the past, keep in mind that's different from the party, who is always struggling for socialism and who are going to be, a really tough nut for the U.S. imperialists to crack if they really want to make China go capitalist. But in the video, again, he was talking about Chinese finance capital, and it always boggles my mind how people believe these talking points about finance capital in China, especially other Marxists, because Lenin talks about finance capital so much, and he explains it so concisely and in a way that I think is pretty simple. But China's banks are largely, and this is something they're criticized by Western media all the time, they're largely controlled by the state, controlled by the central authority. And Western academics in their analyses of China have even said that the privately owned banks and the investments of the private banks, the not state-owned banks, are still public-private hybrids, and they blur the line between public and private property because there's so much regulation and control by the central authorities of even the private banks. But even ignoring that, over 40% of the banks at least are directly controlled by the state. The smaller banks may not be, but they answer to the big four, big five giant state-owned banks, which are the Bank of China, the Chinese Construction Bank, the Industrial Bank, the Commercial Bank. The Industrial and Commercial Bank are basically one, but they do serve two functions. And then the agricultural banks of China. So you have industrial, construction, agricultural. So that's four of the largest banks in the entire world, not just in China, but in the entire world. And they cover all sectors of production in Chinese society: agriculture, industry, commerce. And they're all controlled by the state. They are all, those are what are in control of planning the production of 1.3 billion Chinese people. Production of commodities, which almost the entire world is reliant upon now. So to act like, the state hasn't played any role in socialist construction, or like the state has lost control of the banks, and these are just imperialist, privatized banks, finance capital run amok, running wild, and they gone capitalist. Like, that's just not true. The banks are largely controlled by the state and by the party. And that's something even Western media criticizes them for. This is not the same thing as Western finance capital, which is owned by a handful of oligarchs who control our politicians, not the other way around. It's not the same as the IMF and the World Bank and their puppet banks.
Chinese medicine and education, focused on making a profit, like the rest of the world, are not able to improve the quality of life of ordinary people. Not content with the hard work of its citizens alone, Chinese financial capital, with the support of the party, is introducing high-tech methods for tracking the working population. The system, called social credit, is designed to divide people into groups of respectable, solvent citizens and those who shirk away from work or are otherwise unreliable. Cities are covered by a network of cameras, bringing millions of faces to the police database. At factories, all kinds of control over workers' activities are used that tighten workers' schedules and fine for unacceptable rest. Chinese state corporations and banks don't only exploit their own citizens. The country is dependent on sales in markets in other countries and cannot develop within its own resources, unlike, for example, the Soviet Union. China is forced to export its capital to other countries, transfer industries, maintain the low cost of labor, or even seek cheaper ones when the maintenance of low labor costs becomes impossible. All these measures mean real imperialist expansion. The capitalists of the party bribe the bourgeoisie of less developed countries and support it in the fight against the workers. For example, in Kazakhstan, Chinese capital acquired the majority of oil and gas fields and actively helps the authorities to brutally suppress the struts and actions of Kazakh oil industry workers. Chinese banks are not averse to bribing corrupt elites of weak independent countries and turning them into their debt colonies. The Chinese capitalists give loans to the countries of Asia and Africa for the construction of industrial factories, power plants, and other infrastructure. China uses the capacities of these factories to fulfill the needs of its own industry, and even workplaces that are not occupied by the local citizens or by the Chinese.
Oh, that was painful. It's painful. We're gonna debunk those points one by one, but I wanted to let it play for a while. I eventually had to speed it up. I should have been doing that sooner, man. Holy cow. I mean, they said the people of China, or the Chinese government, or the Communist Party can't improve the standard of living or the quality of life for normal people. I'm literally just gonna pull up the life expectancy in China year by year. What do you mean they can't improve quality of life for regular people? The life expectancy in their country was about 30. Now it is well over 70. You don't think that shows an improved quality of life, huh? They live twice as long. Like, I know this. I'm not sure where Polistern is based out of. I know they're Western Marxist Leninists. I think they might be Euro communists because they publish people from Sweden a lot. But Americans just do not understand what it's like to live on the other side of imperialism where you don't have industrialization. Like, to live in a backwards agrarian society without industrialization or industrialized agriculture, you're subject to famine due to weather conditions. You're subject to so many different things, so many different diseases that have been solved by like modern medicine. And in the industrialization in China has done incredible things. And look at this massive increase in standard of living during Mao. It starts to plateau a little bit. Massive increase again under Deng Xiaoping, starts to plateau. And now we're seeing a recalibration. Not that this is always just going to increase exponentially. But now, they're combating corruption, combating some of the negative things that came about with the market reforms. But this is massively increased standard of life or standard of living for the people of China and just how long they live in general. And they have one of the lowest retirement ages in the world, which hilariously, The Economist, a right-wing Western website, was mad about or tried to point out like a bad thing or make this a bad thing. This is like that meme that people are always saying where Western media will make anything China does into just a bad thing, the worst thing in the world. So it's like China has abolished poverty, but at what cost? How authoritarian did they have to be to do it, to bring their people out of poverty and double their life expectancy? This is at 54, China's average retirement age is too low, according to The Economist. They need people working more. Screw the Chinese government pension program, which has allowed tons of old people to have pensions and retire. Whereas in the U.S., the retirement age has been getting older. And where people do not have pensions and where the government is constantly making cuts to Social Security. But in China, where they're retiring at 54, that's the authoritarian hellscape. Because allowing people to retire doesn't allow capitalists to maximize the exchange value they make selling commodities on a market. And again, one last example of China increasing standard of living for their people, which Polistern said they haven't been able to do at all. This is the United Nations, not necessarily a pro-China organization. An organization that people, including me, have criticized for often being a tool of the Western imperialists. At least certain sections of the United Nations. There are always certain people within the United Nations who are dedicated to doing good work. And that's been the case pretty much since it was founded. But the people who control it, the main administrators, the countries who make up the Security Council, mean that it's often dominated by the West and often used to justify Western imperialism. But the United Nations saluted China's anti-poverty alleviation efforts. Not their anti-poverty alleviation efforts, their anti-poverty efforts or their poverty alleviation efforts. And they talked about China always being, a force for peace in the world and a force for multilateralism, and basically just saluted the poverty alleviation programs and said they're incredible. And people say that China didn't really abolish poverty. This is what the libertarian Ben Politics was telling me the other day. China didn't alleviate poverty with their poverty alleviation programs. That was only relative poverty. And relative poverty is the metric decided by the UN so that they can, determine what poverty is in each country specifically, because it varies. And people are like, that's not real poverty. Like, what other standard do you want besides the UN? Right? People are like, oh, they need to have the same poverty standard as the US. Like, that's just not the case. We underwent industrialization like 150 years earlier than them. Doesn't make sense to compare poverty in China to poverty in the US. It's relative. But, regardless, the United Nations recognized it as incredible. And yet Americans and libertarians and dogmatists will try and dismiss it as nothing. And this Marxist-Leninist account, Polistern, who we're watching, dismisses it as nothing. He just said China's not able to rate or hasn't been able to raise a standard of living for their people. The first years of Mao were the fastest increase in standard of living and life expectancy ever in human history. And also his thing about the credit system, the social credit system, is another just blatant lie. Just a blatant lie. The social credit system is mostly for business transactions with like small businesses and banks. It's for increasing transparency within the petty bourgeoisie in the banking sector or small business. And people largely support it because of that. So it's an effort to decrease corruption. And they act like it's something it's not. They literally do like no research on this, or they're just making shit up or believing what they see in memes. But all you have to do is Google the social credit system. This is foreignpolicy.com, which is basically a regime change propaganda arm of the US State Department, not a pro-China communist website. China's social credit system is actually quite boring. A supposedly Orwellian system is fragmentized, localized, and mostly targeted at businesses. But here we have a Marxist-Leninist outlet or educator acting like China's social credit system is what you see it as in like TikTok memes. Like, come on, man, do a Google search. Like, that was just a blatant lie you told about China. You're just parroting random propaganda. And then they also said China cannot develop by itself. China is dependent on other countries. Again, it's basically the opposite. China has become like the productive base for the rest of the world. And their developmental loans are helping the rest of the world develop. So it's literally the opposite. Whereas the US and the IMF and the financial oligarchy in the US is holding back development. And I recommend everyone check this out. America's neoliberal financialization policy versus China's industrial socialism. China has done nothing but develop their productive capacity and develop their industrial base. So how is a Marxist-Leninist going to say that China's been completely unable to develop themselves? And they say China's reliant on global markets. They're reliant on other countries. That's every country in the world. That is how a globalized, modernized economy works. The Soviet Union was more isolated. They were isolated by sanctions and the non-existence of other socialist countries to trade with. And the economy back then was not nearly as globalized by the increase in technology and therefore increase in exchange and the rate of exchange of commodities, which has been brought about by technology. The economy was not that globalized back then. You did not have the level of global trade that you have today. It was globalizing. But now today, China in the modern economy, in the modern global economy, has other socialist countries they can trade with. And not just that, but they've combated the way that the U.S. tries to isolate their allies from the rest of the world, albeit at certain costs, but by making the U.S. dependent on them, by allowing the U.S. to invest and basically making the U.S. capitalists dependent on China for their productive base. And they've helped countries develop themselves productively with the Belt and Road Initiative, getting other nations off their dependency on the U.S. dominated financial system, on the IMF and World Bank, developing their productive capabilities, their real productive capabilities, not just enriching financial oligarchs and, wealthy capitalists like what the U.S. does and U.S. banks do, but actually investing developmental loans with very low interest, around 4% interest, helping countries increase their productive capacity, their real productive capacity, and allowing them to become trade partners with China. So yeah, you can say that's China being dependent on foreign markets or dependent on other countries. But that's just socialist internationalism, right? That's just supporting the development of other countries. And you could take like one-off examples where like Kazakh workers are striking at a factory where China's invested or has given some developmental loans, but it's not the same as the U.S. exporting capital and then reactionarily suppressing any kind of resistance to their export capital in that country. China's foreign policy is completely non-interventionist, even according to Yanis Varoufakis, who's like a Greek sort of
very concerned lately about
Putin
China
evil socked
and
them,
sort of their.
And we've watched this video a lot, but Yanis talks about how China's foreign policy is much different than anything the U.S. has done because it's completely non-interventionist. There's zero strings attached, whereas the IMF and the World Bank have all these strings attached with their structural adjustment loans. And then Western analysts project what the U.S. and the IMF have done onto China and claim China is doing the same thing without looking at the specifics of China's so-called finance capital or China's loans, their developmental loans, or their foreign policy. And if anyone would read Marx, instead of just learning Marx from YouTube videos or whatever, they would know that China has said they don't export revolution, right? They don't arm or fund revolutionary groups across the world or socialist revolutionary groups across the world like the Soviet Union used to. But they do help countries develop their productive bases. So a lot of these countries still have large peasant populations, right? They haven't industrialized. They don't have the same productive forces that countries in the West do. And as these productive bases develop, you see a proletarianization of society, meaning more of society can be in the working class, in the industrial working class, like we were talking about earlier with the concentration into the cities as people go after industrial jobs. This creates the proletariat and increases the productive forces, which creates the possibility for socialism. So China's not exporting revolution, but they're creating the possibility for socialism in like 85% of countries in the world who until now have been suppressed by the US dominated global financial system. Yeah. So they're not exporting revolution, arming and funding revolutionary groups, like, the USSR, Cuba had done on occasion. They're playing the long game. They're trying to create the global conditions for socialist revolution and for a global system of mutual development. So yeah, even workers' revolution taking place in a place where China is helping them develop their productive forces. We're not scare or frighten the Chinese authorities. They are completely non-interventionist in how they deal with that. And we don't have to go over the Belt and Road Initiative for the millionth time, but it's very similar to the Marshall Plan, the developmental loans that the U.S. gave to their allies in West Europe. There's about a 4% interest rate on those loans, very easy to pay back. China just forgave the debt on like 17 different African countries. They're like, whatever, we don't really even care. Just develop yourselves and trade with us. Yeah, and it says China uses these countries who are part of the Belt and Road Initiative or their global allies for their own industrial needs. So, yeah, that's a good thing. That's called trading, right? China has their own interests and their own economic needs. So do these other countries. And if these countries are developed, if they can actually produce a lot instead of being underdeveloped, not only can they be richer themselves, but they can trade with China the products and the raw materials that China doesn't have. This is called mutual development. This is what the U.S. doesn't do. The U.S. tries to isolate countries, sanction them, stop them from trading, bomb the productive forces in countries like Yugoslavia who are aiming at development and global cooperation. China's doing the opposite of that. They're increasing global cooperation and global productivity, global mutual development.
While the local bourgeoisie receives major bribes from its Chinese partners, the poor continue to live under the oppression of debt bondage and unemployment. Aiming at the maximum profit, Chinese capital does not stop depleting resources of neighboring countries and does not forget to cover it up with words about partnership and so-called joint ventures. The deforestation on Russian land by Chinese companies, together with greedy and disregarding governors, has already led the South Siberian and Transbaikal regions of Russia to environmental disaster.
Environmental imperialism. Oh no. China's investing in these countries. That means they're stealing their resources. China helped industrialize certain places in Russia and Africa who were hopelessly debt-trapped by the IMF and World Bank, living in extreme poverty and complete dependence on the Western financial oligarchy. China helped them industrialize, but they cut down a bunch of trees. Invade them now! We need to do it for Greta Thunberg and Sunrise. Yeah, China's military also planted a forest the size of Ireland, while the U.S. military was busy being a larger polluter than most entire countries. And I'm not kidding, by the way. The U.S. military ranks like 68th in the world if you rank them among countries who pollute. And I'm not kidding about China either. They literally planted a forest the size of Ireland to combat deforestation and climate change. This is socialism. How can people look at this? Look at China's economic planning and their economic plans, which combat all the horrible things that the market does, and try and move towards economic sustainability, move away from poverty, and move towards, economic sustainability in the terms of their people and in terms of the environment and the ecology. And people look at this, even when China's saying we're not done yet, this isn't, the end goal, but we're in a process of construction and we're working on getting there. People still look at this and they're like, no, evil, that's the same thing as the U.S. That's the same thing the U.S. military is doing. No, it's not. The U.S. military is killing people. They're slaughtering people. They're polluting. And they're doing it at the behest of Western financial capitalists and oligarchs, oil interests and the like. China's not doing that. They're not, the U.S. has nearly 1,000 military bases abroad. China has less than 10. They're planting forests. The U.S. is bombing. As Danny Haifeng and the Friends of Socialist China say, who everyone should check out, China builds, the U.S. bombs. And of course, when I say that, I mean the U.S. government, not the U.S. people. The people need to rise up against our corrupt imperialist government.
It is known that the policy of imperialist expansion is not limited to depleting resources and the forcing of economic dependence. China is preparing to defend possessive interests of its capitalists by armed force. A few years ago in Tajikistan, a whole region of the country was occupied by the Chinese army because of a debt for the credit forced by the Chinese and unpaid by the Tajik government. Along with mercenaries from the USA, Russia, and France, Chinese armed forces operate in African republics, appropriating valuable lands and mineral deposits. Among major territorial claims of the PRC are Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Russia, Japan, India, and Bhutan.
So this is why I don't think this critique is in good faith, because there's so many things with the social credit system and with saying that China has been unable to increase standard of living for their people. There are so many things that are just untrue, fabricated, blatant lies. It's not, stretching the truth, exaggerating, or playing up something that happened. It's blatant lies. And this is another one. This is yet another example. The government of Tajikistan approved more Chinese security presence because they were nervous about either U.S.-led regime change through Afghanistan, where the U.S. invaded and occupied for 20 years, or chaos that the U.S. created in Afghanistan going through the border and affecting Tajikistan, which shares their southern border is shared with Afghanistan. So they were concerned about U.S. interventionism. And even the CIA arm, literal CIA propaganda arm created by the CIA, Radio Free Europe, says that's why China's doing this, because Tajikistan asked them to come. And China's newly developed base is near the border of Afghanistan. so they can help prevent from either U.S. interventionism or, U.S. caused chaos by their interventionism in the Middle East or West Asia. So this video says they're teaming up with mercenaries from the U.S. and France to literally occupy Tajikistan and just enforce debt on them and make them pay more money that they don't have. Like, if U.S. and French mercenaries are there, that is the security threat that China and probably Russia, since they said there too, are there to defend against. The U.S. and their allies and their financial oligarchy are the ones who have been overthrowing and destabilizing countries and abusing human rights and infringing on economic and political sovereignty for the last however long, years. And people are sick of it, and they're asking Russia and China for help in a lot of cases. In some cases, military help and security help. And that's, that was the case here. As the U.S. is using mercenary groups, literally private armies, to try and enforce their preferred government abroad, or try and enact regime change in governments they don't like. And yeah, let's not forget that the U.S. funding of the Mujahideen and the arming of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union in the late 70s and early 80s had effects on the entire region, not just Afghanistan, the entire Middle East, because extremist groups splintered out of that then. And they used the funding and the arming and the recruiting they were able to do during the time they were backed by the U.S., which has had lasting effects to this day. Extremist groups all around the region to this day. But then when China helps Tajikistan with their security issues, we're like, oh, China's evil. They're not socialist because they sent their military over here. Like, the U.S. sent their military over there and armed a bunch of extremist terrorists. But when China does something to combat that, all of a sudden they're not real socialists. And then it talks about China setting up on the valuable mineral deposits in Africa. Yes, countries need developmental loans to create the machinery and the economic outlays needed to extract and process and utilize their own resources. Countries who have been prevented from doing this by the actual imperialists and by the Western finance capitalists. So why does Venezuela, a socialist country, have fuel and oil shortages when they have the largest reserves of oil in the entire world? It's because they don't have the machinery or the technological capability right now to refine their own oil. One of their main problems is they don't have enough refined oil to run the machines that are needed to refine more oil. Because of the U.S. sanctions, because of the U.S. enforced blockade, because of the isolation they're forced into by the U.S. So even though they have more oil than any other country, they're having an oil shortage because they can't take it out of the ground and refine it. So, and what other socialist and anti-imperialist countries, especially Iran, have done has been sending Venezuela literally tankers of refined oil past the U.S. blockade, or technicians to help refine oil. And the U.S. will often bribe technicians from Venezuela also as well to try and get them to flee the country, internal sabotage. And, that is what the China's Belt and Road does for Africa. The same kind of thing Iran is trying to do for Venezuela. They're not occupying valuable mineral deposits that hadn't been accessed before. They're allowing access to those minerals for the country that they're investing in. In exchange for that country acting as a trade partner. They increase their production, which means they increase the export of commodities. And now they can trade those commodities with China, whereas U.S. imperialism would just set up export capital, set up a mine on that mineral deposit, and exploit the entire surplus for themselves. That's far from what China's doing. It's like Michael Parenti says, no country is poor. Every country is rich in resources. No country's over poor. Some countries are just overexploited. The U.S. has been occupying or at least U.S. companies have been occupying and taking the valuable resources from the global South for years. China is giving countries the technological and productive capacities and capabilities to extract their own resources.
Instead of establishing cells of the Communist International, the CPC establishes so-called Confucius Institutes, imposes traditional values everywhere instead of the ideas of proletarian struggle, and conducts national expansion instead of international assistance to workers of other countries. Yet this...
There's so much projection They're literally just trying to take stuff in China and compare it to stuff the US does. Confucius Institutes, they control other countries and expand China's national values. Oh, you mean like NGOs? Oh, you mean like the NED? The arms of US imperialism who are everywhere, who actually do that, who actually we have evidence of them doing that. And I'd like to, investigate the Confucius Institutes more, or investigate this video's claims, but it doesn't give a shred of evidence or justification for this claim. They just say there are these institutes that impose traditional values and conduct national expansion. What does that mean? What does that mean?
What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? I had a dream, but what does it mean? What does it mean?
What does it mean? What does it mean that these institutes impose traditional values and conduct national expansion? Give me evidence. There's no evidence in this here video. It's so hollow.
Despite capitalist restoration in China and disintegration in the Communist Party, the Chinese proletariat has impressive experience in fighting against capitalism in the past, and therefore there is hope for the future. The Chinese have long and selflessly led national liberation struggles. They fought robbery, economic dependence, and direct intervention of the imperialist powers. They created millions of peasant armies and Marxism-based cells that enlarged to the amount of thousands of workers' organizations in industrial centers. More than 30 years of civil war have taught them to fight against the bourgeoisie and nationalists, and this is more relevant today than ever. The crisis in the capitalist system revived the strike movement at Chinese factories. More than 1,000 major strikes and protests have occurred in the country over the past year, and the number of industrial disputes is growing. In 1993, there were only 8,000, and in 2012, more than 850,000. Workers at Chinese factories, transport workers, and builders, as well as displaced internal migrants, create committees for organized actions. Slow but steady, the largest group of the world's proletariat rises up, and it means that despite statements by reactionaries and party populists, the real color of China should be, and will be, red. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. There will be uprisings in China soon that we will support. So we'll talk about this. They talk about the disintegration of the party, which the same party that just took huge steps to combat corruption within themselves, and that are 95 million members strong. Western socialists with our Communist Party of like 5,000 are looking at the 95 million member Communist Party in China. So active and so theoretically educated and so ingrained in their community and way of life. And we're just like, they're not real communists. We're the ones who really get it. Do we though? Do we though? Because they just alleviated poverty. And where have you been? What have you been doing, Polistern International? Did you alleviate poverty? What China did is not just capitalist restoration, plain and simple. There was an increase in capitalist elements for a while, but it was ultimately a deepening of the struggle for socialism and the struggle against imperialism. And they talk about, various workers' uprisings and various workers' organizations that are still going on in China and struggle that's still going on in China. And yes, class struggle, or even, the revolution itself, continues under socialism until global capitalism is abolished. This is a very important modern Marxist analysis, and an analysis that's been developed mostly by China and Chinese intellectuals who have deeply studied their own construction of socialism, as well as the USSR and all the other global socialist experiments that we've known. And basically doing what Lenin said and taking the entire experience of the working class in general and using that to make our theory for going forward. They've developed this theory of how class struggle is carried out under socialism, because workers and the workers' state, dictatorship of the proletariat, can't immediately abolish capital or can't immediately abolish the bourgeoisie. So thus you still have classes. So thus class struggle is going to continue under socialism. And this shows the importance of China's anti-corruption efforts and the maintained strength and political and economic relevance of the 95 million member Communist Party. Because class struggle is still going on. You still do have a bourgeoisie in China. They recognize this. And it does need to be combated. The workers need to, constantly struggle. And as we said, recalibrate their construction of socialism and make sure that they're in control of the economy and the party. And ultras will say that class struggle under socialism is anti-Marxist. But Marx he didn't get to see the social experiments of the day, right? Lenin and Stalin, after the dictatorship of the proletariat is established in the Soviet Union, they're already saying, we're going to have to work together with the capitalists in some ways. Or they're already saying class struggle will continue under socialism, right? This is something Lenin and Stalin said. The idea was developed by China, but it was created right away because, the most developed socialist experiment Marx would see, other than the utopian socialists, the anti-authoritarian socialists who he criticized, was the Paris Commune. And that's where he really comes up with his idea and fleshes out his idea of dictatorship of the proletariat after a deep analysis. So he basically says that if workers want to construct socialism, they have to seize state power. They have to seize authority and, use whatever means to protect themselves, protect the revolution from the bourgeoisie, and build, a worker society and develop new actual democratic institutions, because the existing capitalist state isn't a real democracy. It's a faux democracy. It's never been democratic. So there's so much construction that has to be done after workers seize the state before, the capitalist class can just be abolished, especially in a country like China that was feudal. They weren't industrialized, right? Marx is talking about going from capitalism to socialism. They had to go from feudalism to socialism. But when, in the process of going from feudalism to communism, if it looks a little too much like capitalism or state capitalism, Western Marxists are just like, nope, not real socialism. Like, read what Chinese intellectuals are actually saying. They've developed Marxism well beyond Marx. Yeah. So, and they're also encouraging liberation struggles within China. That's how they end this video, right? The socialist video. And I made a comment about that at the end. They're saying the workers are now rising up, and they're not talking about the class struggle that still exists under socialism that I was talking about, right? Because they're against the party and they're against the state, which the party is made up of the Chinese workers. That's like their number one weapon in the continuing class struggle and in the continued construction of socialism. But this person's against the party. So they're not really for the workers, because the party is the most powerful tool of the workers. But they're encouraging national liberation struggles, people rising up within China. They say, stay tuned. There's going to be uprisings soon. Pretty much all of the groups rising up violently in China are right-wing US-backed separatist movements, which are not supported by actual Chinese people living in China. But if they're supported by anyone other than the CIA and the NED and US NGOs and USAID, it's the diaspora, people who have left China, who are given a loudspeaker by US media and the NED to spread regime change propaganda about China. Meanwhile, the US media ignores actual people living in China, or actual people living in, say, Xinjiang, China, when they're talking about supposed human rights abuses. They only talk to the diaspora, Chinese Americans. They never talk to people actually living in China. But that's just because the U.S. media are evil pieces of poop who are corrupted beyond belief. But if I think about the separatist movements, or movements who might rise up in China, who the U.S. would want to rise up violently, I think of the Free Tibet movement, or Taiwanese separatists, or the ETIM, who are, again, powerful thanks to the U.S. funding and arming of the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden's group in Afghanistan, which we talked about earlier, and removing them from the terrorist list so they could create more chaos in Xinjiang, which led to some really terrible and violent terror attacks against Chinese civilians. Or you have the Falun Gong, which is mostly based in the U.S., but is a separatist group in China. These are the groups of people I think of who would rise up against the party and the government in China. The party and the government, which, like I said, are tools of the working class for the most part, and tools against imperialism. So by this video encouraging people to rise up against the party and government, that's what I feel like they're encouraging. And that's why I don't know if this video, I don't know if they're a good actor or a good faith actor. But yeah, all of those groups I mentioned, all of those separatist groups in China are extremist movements with only a tiny fraction of support, nowhere near the majority, 5% or so at max, if you include like the diaspora who supports like free Tibet and stuff like that. They're not relevant within China. Although the ETIM has carried out some horrific terror attacks in Xinjiang, China, like I said, since the U.S. removed them from the terrorist listing, which is how China's re-education and anti-terrorism policies in Xinjiang began, which the U.S. then said was genocide. So you see how it works. The U.S. gives a bunch of money to terrorists and extremist groups, and then encourages them and takes them off the list of terrorist groups, same way they did with the KLA in Yugoslavia. And then when China does something to combat the terrorists killing civilians, the U.S. says, oh, they're doing genocide. See, we need to invade them and get more involved. So that's actually a good example of how it works. But, the U.S. media gives these separatist groups and these extremist groups just undying relevance and undying support. And never-ending encouragement to overthrow their own government, even if it means terror tactics. We'll tour the Dalai Lama around, even though he was a feudal landlord who tortured people and gouged out the eyes of peasants who disobeyed him, and accumulated massive wealth in Tibet off the backs of his peasants while preaching, non-attachment and non-materialism. The CIA props them up and supports them and gives support to these movements like Free Tibet, which are extremist movements with no actual support in China. So that's just what comes to mind when I see, a socialist talking about just wait on it. There are people rising up in China against the party and against the state. Like the only people violently rising up against the party and the state are literal like CIA-backed extremists. There are people there, the workers are engaging in class struggle. They're trying to, maintain theoretical and socialist principles within the party, which involves things like anti-corruption efforts. But it's far from, a rise up against the party or against the state. It's a struggle to control them. But, yeah. And keep in mind that in Ukraine in 2014, the U.S. was trying to turn the Euromaidan protests, which were, more nonviolent mass protests created by the U.S. and their NGOs and USAID and propped up by them. But the way that the U.S. was able to escalate Euromaidan into a violent coup was by giving money and weapons to the neo-Nazis, the violent ones who actually wanted to fully, take power and overthrow the government, not just people who wanted to protest. So, even though there were a lot of well-meaning people there at those protests, maybe tricked by the U.S., but well-meaning, by, giving support to the extremists, they were able to turn them into a coup and then pretended like it was some historic struggle for liberation. So that's the same thing they're trying to do with, several different groups in China. So just be wary of anybody talking about groups rising up and fighting for liberation or freedom in China. Like, when people say free Tibet, you have to say Mao already freed Tibet. They had slaves. They had no industrialization. They lived in poverty. Their eyes could be gouged out, and they were constantly tortured by the oppressive feudal lord. And they were ruled over as slaves, and the Communist Party liberated them. Would we call the Union Army and Abraham Lincoln oppressive because they used violence and had to fight a war to free the slaves? Should we say free the Confederacy? Of course not. So the U.S.'s liberation and freedom struggles are never what they appear to be. Maybe that's not what Polistern International is talking about, but whatever. Either way, it's good to bring up. And yeah, the idea, he's talking about the proletariat rising up against capitalism in China. That part's true. Like I said, class struggle continues under socialism. But Chinese revolutionaries and party intellectuals have been saying this for decades, right? And they've been quoting Marxists from the 1910s and 1920s who were saying class struggle would persist under socialism. So it's just communism being an infantile disorder in the West, right? It's Westerners not being as theoretically advanced as China and these other socialist countries yet. We haven't actually really started organizing that much. The working class doesn't think of themselves as a revolutionary agent yet. in any way. So we kind of have Westerners come along with their half-baked analysis of actual developed socialist countries a lot. And they're like, wow, China has finance capital. Lenin's got a chapter on finance capital. I guess they're capitalist and imperialist, just like the U.S. I guess their market reforms basically made them the U.S. 2.0, U.S. in the East. But now, I'll support the proletariat rising up against the party and government. Free to hashtag free Tibet, hashtag free Taiwan. Like, no, the party and the government have their problems and their failures, but they are the number one tool of the people. And there were a huge number of people, by example, who were furious at the government and the party for not reacting more harshly to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, because they see it as a blatant act of U.S. aggression, it's encouraging separatism in Taiwan, which is undemocratic, like we said. And the Chinese people wanted their government or the party to protect them against that. That's what they want these institutions to protect them from. But the U.S. does something like visit Taiwan, and then when the Chinese government, lines their military in the streets, in a show of force against the U.S. is like, oh, they're so authoritarian. Look, they have tanks. Authoritarian, tanky. It's like the people wanted their government to protect them from the U.S. because the U.S. has been overthrowing countries and killing people and holding people in poverty for years. And they know Nancy Pelosi doesn't care about the people of Taiwan. She's trying to use Taiwan as a pawn to threaten the mainland. And the people of Taiwan see the people on the mainland as their brothers and sisters, and they see themselves as part of China. So the tool in the party, while they do have their flaws, and while the people criticize them, and while the people have tried, enacted various efforts to make sure they're maintaining control of the party and the state, those are the people's number one tools against the imperialist West. So when Western Marxists are arguing that the Chinese people should, dismantle their party and state and rise up against it, it's ridiculous. You're basically just parroting imperialist regime change talking points. And China makes a big deal still of not forgetting their colonial history, not forgetting what they call the century of humiliation, where they were subjugated to Western and Japanese colonialism. Not forgetting the Opium Wars, where the British purposefully enforced opium addiction on the Chinese people as a tool of colonialism, as a tool to make them easier to exploit and less resistant to that exploitation. And the workers' state and the Communist Party has been the Chinese proletariat's way to fight back against this, to fight against colonialism and imperialism and exploitation, while also modernizing their country and bringing people out of poverty. So, even if this Polistern International video and this guy isn't an op, if they're just making really well-produced, well-viewed Marxist videos in an earnest effort to educate and organize people, it still needs to be criticized. No investigation, no right to speak. That's what Mao said. And these half-baked conclusions about China, are stemming from propaganda, for one, Western propaganda, and lies. For example, the lies about the social credit system. But two, a lack of research, right? Because as socialists and Marxists, we have to study. We need communist discipline, which means studying these things intensely. Lenin's 3 keys to success were 1, read, 2, read, and 3, read. Lenin was asked once, or Engels was asked, would you rather have a wife or a mistress? He thought about it and he said, I'd rather have a wife, someone who's loyal to me, someone who I can come home to every night. And Marx was asked the same thing, and Marx said a mistress. Keep life exciting. He was a little bit more of a party animal. He chose a mistress. And Lenin was asked the same thing. Would you rather have a wife or a mistress? And he said, both. I would have the wife hang out with the mistress so I could go find a quiet place to read. So study hard. That's one of Carlos's favorite stories. I thought I'd tell it for him. One of his favorite Marxist parables. All right, I haven't read the chat in so long. I just ranted for like 2 hours. I'm going to have to cut that up into multiple videos to upload it on YouTube. But no, I'm tired. Let's check what the chat's up to. That was such a long video. Karl Marx was DTF. Yeah, facts. All right, that's enough chat for today. I'm done with you guys. Just kidding. The West are crybullies. This video is 90% negative about China. Yeah. The 100 years of humiliation was not that long ago. Facts. Mao, no investigation, no right to speak. Facts. Why would China do this? I didn't get any super chats that I missed, did I? I think I would have got a notification about the super chats. Oh, man. You didn't investigate Polistern before explaining your theory as Eurocom West. Where are they from? Because I said a couple things, though. I said that their idea about social imperialism originated from Maoists in China. And I said that they could be from Europe because they publish a lot of people from Sweden. So maybe I accidentally implied that they are Eurocom, but they publish, Eurocom authors. But where are they from? I did do a lot of research on them, actually. I did quite a bit of reading on their about page. I sent the super chat. You did, Paul? Thank you. Why didn't I see it? What was it? I don't see it. Do you just mean like a super chat, like it was super cool and good? Not like an actual super chat where you send me money? Send us money. Just read Polistern about us on their website. Shares absolutely nothing about who they are. Yeah, I had notes. That video is just going for a super long time. And I hadn't done, the most thorough research into Polistern that I possibly could have. But I had notes about their About Us page and about their website that were just like sketchy. Like they're one of their goals, their fifth and final goal is like to create trained Marxists, which is like that, what the US media, propaganda media weaponized against Black Lives Matter and against various left-wing organizations because Black Lives Matter said, one of their leaders said, like, we're trained Marxists, which is a weird thing to say. And definitely something I could see like a PSYOP website saying, not to accuse Polistern of anything, but there were weird things on their website is all I'm saying. But I mean, it's always good to be skeptical of that. I'd love to go on their stream sometime, though. An actual one? Dang it, I missed it. Sorry, Paul. What did you say? If you tell me what you said, or if you had a question in your super chat, I can talk about it or whatever. There's a video on opportunism and revisionism that has Carlos in it. Well, if they called out Carlos, I'm glad I could call them out. These like ultra videos critiquing China, it always just comes down to like a lack of research or just the most superficial argument. Or like I was saying there when they were talking about the Confucian Institutes and trying to pretend these are just like US NGOs. There's never any evidence, there's never any examples. And if you look into them, it's like the Tajikistan example, where they're like China was there and US and French mercenaries were there. It's like, okay, when I looked into the details of the situation, Tajikistan had asked China to come protect them from the US and French mercenaries. So quit acting like China is teaming up with the US and French mercenaries to overthrow foreign governments. Like, and that's where, I don't know, that's where I worry about or think maybe, it's not an honest actor. Because they're literally like fabricating things, making up lies that I can't even find in Western propaganda news to accuse China of, but whatever. Whatever. You can have capitalists in socialist or communist or democratic countries. I don't think you can have capitalists in communist countries. Communism is the abolition of class, but I didn't even know you could give super chats on Twitch. I don't know if you can. You can do like I don't know. I used to have it set up so every time somebody would subscribe or send me something on Twitch, it would go, "Yeah, boy." But that might just be on Streamlabs, which I might have to stream on Streamlabs next time. Just because we're running out of space on StreamYards. And Streamlabs is kind of better anyways, unless we're interviewing someone. Maybe it still does that on Twitch. Maybe Twitch still goes, "Yeah, boy," every time someone follows or donates or something. In communist China or the DPRK, the businesses answer to the workers' parties. Facts, Cobra. Thank you. I asked if you can compare Lenin's NEP with China's socialist market economy. You said China went Lenin's way, so I was wondering if you think China's approach with Lenin's NEP were same/similar. Yes, that is actually exactly what I meant. Thank you, Paul, for bringing that up, because that'll allow me to explain what I meant more in detail. Deng Xiaoping and his sort of faction of the party, a more right-wing-ish, or Leninist, or by right wing, I mean a little bit more pro-capitalist, a little bit more pro-market, rather than so much top-down planning. That's all I mean by right wing. I don't mean it in the sense of like conservative or social values or whatever. Right and left traditionally in socialism means pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist, or the ultra left are people who want to abolish capitalism tomorrow, right? So Lenin was in favor of like a slower transition to capitalism that allowed more markets, called the NEP, which was enacted at first before Stalin went ahead with a more top-down model, which allowed for more of the Soviet surplus to be put into military spending, which allowed them to defeat the Nazis in World War II, which every Western analyst thought they were going to get crushed in. And Deng Xiaoping and his faction of the Communist Party in China were arguing for an NEP style model, basically exactly what Lenin laid out with the NEP, like you said, Paul. They're saying we should do this, and actually, there were people who starved in famines during the time of Mao and during the collectivization process, and American bourgeois scholars will say, 8 million bajillion people died during the collectivization process under Mao. Actually, half of China died because Mao killed them all and then he ate them. But where they actually get their numbers from about the people who died under Mao is from Deng Xiaoping, who after Mao was doing this political campaign where he said, here's the number of people, like 16,000 people or whatever, who died under Mao in the collectivization, which even China admitted they don't know exactly how many people died because they didn't have the record keeping capabilities back then. But Deng Xiaoping said if we would have gone ahead with my model, if we would have allowed more foreign investment and more foreign markets similar to Lenin's NEP, we could have avoided these deaths. We could have collectivized a lot easier and, with less struggle. So it was part of like an ideological political campaign that now the U.S. has taken and used to say, Mao is the most evil man who ever lived, even though he did amazing things for his country. But yes, Deng Xiaoping and his faction of the party advocated for something very similar to Lenin's NEP, to the point where, they even use the NEP as an example of this is what we want to do. Because if you read the debates within the Communist Party of China during the early stages, which I recommend everybody does, they're closely analyzing everything the Soviet Union did in the early years. Down to the most minute detail, saying this is what the Soviets did, this is what Yugoslavia did, this is what this Soviet country did. What can we do? How can we take what worked and criticize and negate and leave behind what didn't work? That's why we see socialism as an experiment. That's why socialist theory is the collective experience of the working class of the whole world taken in general. And China's theorists understand that better than anyone. Deng and Mao both. New here, wanting to learn more about Marxism, and this looked interesting. Wow, well, I have a podcast on Vygotsky I want to send you, because your name is Trotsky Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky, educational psychologist in the Soviet Union, if that's who you're talking about. We did a podcast with Curry Mallet about Lev Vygotsky. Curry Mallet is part of PSL, or their Liberation School. So basically, Curry Mallet had a lot of really revolutionary ideas about education and a lot of really scathing criticisms of capitalist education and how it's ableist and how it doesn't tailor education to the individual, right? It tailors education to making people cogs in the machine, including people with various disabilities, whether they be learning disabilities or physical disabilities. And the education system should be designed to maximize and develop the people's talents, their individual talents, which are going to be different and vary based on the person. But instead, we have a one-size-fits-all standardized system. And Lev Vygotsky also made so many advancements in the field of educational psychology, so many just basic advancements that are widely universally acknowledged today, that he has to be taught in the Western education system. You just have to, because he's part of the history, because he used Marxism-Leninism, applying that to educational psychology, dialectical materialism, to make a lot of advancements. But when he's taught in the West, and this is what our podcast is about, and sorry, I'm actually sending it now. Oops, it didn't send on Facebook. Oh well. When Lev Vygotsky is taught in the West, Marx is literally taken out of the curriculum, and every reference to Marx, every revolutionary idea, every idea criticizing ableist capitalist education is systematically removed from his work, so that American teachers aren't taught it. And this is something I've tried to show to every education major I know, because they all know who Vygotsky is. They all learn about Vygotsky in school. And it's like, okay, learn about the revolutionary stuff he said. Learn about how inspired he was by the October Revolution in the Soviet Union. I know a little bit about Vygotsky, like zone, proximal development, scaffolding, etc. I don't know all of his theory or how it connects to the Soviet era. I graduated in psych, for sure. I mean, most people don't. Most people know, not most people, but people who majored in educational psychology or education know about what you know. Which, the average person doesn't know that, but experts in those fields. But what they don't know is Vygotsky's connection to the Soviet Union. They don't know his revolutionary theory. They don't know his connection to Marx. They don't know what he wrote about ableism. So, yeah, I think you'll enjoy that. When I learned about communism, they basically said it was authoritarian and people were hungry. This is high school, by the way, yeah. High school usually doesn't go much further than that. Same, they lied to us for real. They really did. They really did. All right, y'all, I've been going for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I'm about to fall asleep at my desk. I should go text my girlfriend. I told her I wasn't going to stream for an insane amount of time today. And yet here we are. I guess this is an insane amount of time. But thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you for people who support us on Patreon, support us with the super chats. You are the reason we're able to do Midwestern Marx. I worked on my book quite a bit today. Got a book about Venezuela coming out. The Midwestern Marx Publishing Press is supported by you all. So thank you very much for that. And, obviously not everyone can support financially or wants to, but if you could like, comment, or subscribe or share the stream, that also helps us a ton. All right, I'm done self-promoting. Thank you all. Much love to the chat. Organize, educate, solidarity.